welcome to the CU Catecast. I'm Father Ryan Humphries. We're very happy to have you today. And we're talking today about the moral gray areas. I call this talk Wine to Cheer Men's Hearts because, the ministry of Jesus literally begins with Jesus, God, transforming water into wine for the purpose of a party. And of course, the New Testament ends, the book of Revelation ends by describing heaven as an eternal wedding reception, basically, an eternal wedding party. Psalm 104 reminds us, and this is from the Old Testament, of course, you cause the grass to grow for the cattle, O Lord, and plants for man to cultivate, that he may bring forth fruit from the earth, and wine to gladden the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, and bread to strengthen his heart. And so we have in this psalm an appreciation of steak, which is important. Unfortunately, the Jews didn't have bacon, but that's a separate moment. But we have here a celebration of wine, specifically just to make us feel better about the universe around us. And we have cosmetic products, oil to make you look good. Because back then, you just rubbed olive oil in your face. That was what you had, and that was what you did. And so we have this kind of paradoxical sort of thing where we have the Lord very, very clearly, very directly in the Old and New Testaments saying that human joy, simply the pleasure of living life and the good things of life are good. The Song of Songs in the Old Testament is a whole book of the Bible, which is functionally an erotic love poem that celebrates sexual passion. At the same time, the Lord calls us to be perfect as He is perfect. He tells us that sins against the flesh and excess love of food and drink and money and sex are damning for us. Strive to enter through the narrow gate, for broad is the way that leads to damnation. And we even know that in an ideal world, the Lord kind of made it clear that if we were in a perfect world, a perfect situation, we would roll out of bed, give a big old stretch, and immediately start our hours and hours of personal prayer, that we would only take a break from those in order to do ministry to someone else or to meet the needs of the body. And yet, how many of us are genuinely capable of that degree of praying always? Even modern medical science and psychology have made their contributions and talked to us about how things like alcohol and tobacco and social media are poisonous, and yet there's also a certain sense of them being helpful and good and associated with a sense of being part of the community and a social connectedness. And so it becomes kind of one of these fascinating things where we say, clearly, the Lord gives us no right and no encouragement to sin, full stop. And yet there are moral gray areas where it is not crystal clear how the Lord wants us to deal with things. And again, in a perfect world, we wouldn't have any of that. But we live in the world in which we live. And so there are some of these moral gray areas that we need to choose or not choose, right? I can be a non-drinker, or I can certainly have something to drink. I can be a non-smoker, or maybe I can have a cigar with friends. I could choose never to watch any TV or movies. I could choose never to use social media. Incidentally, I gave up social media for the most part about a year ago and feel great about it. Trust me. I look at Instagram maybe once every third week, and I look at Facebook about once a month, and it's for about 10 minutes to check the inbox thing, and that's it. And boy, do I feel better about my life. But we can choose to engage those things or not, and it's not in and of itself sinful. But it's also not good, because there's a little bit of playing with fire. And so why is it that the Lord gives us these kind of competing moral principles, and what do we do with them? One of my very favorite authors is C.S. Lewis, and he summed up this whole kind of conundrum in his excellent book, Mere Christianity, when he explains that a good stiff drink is sometimes a good thing when we are celebrating, but it's only a good thing if I don't need it to celebrate. He says, if I need that drink, then that drink is bad for me and I should not take it. He kind of wants to describe that area where these social things kind of lift us up, but they don't really weigh us down. And if we need them, then they're going to weigh us down. But if we don't need them, they lift us up. And it's one of these kind of fascinating things, and it's worth talking about because every single one of us, in some way, shape, or form, leans into these moral gray areas. It's very, very difficult in the world in which we live not to do so. Certainly, it's not particularly hard if someone says, I don't want to drink, or if someone says, I don't want to smoke, but it is challenging to say, I don't want to look at something that is sexually suggestive, because you turn on the freaking news and you've got this kind of stuff going on. You you drive down the road and you've got billboards offering everything from a yoga Pilates class with somebody who's wearing less clothes than a French bikini model from the 60s. And then at the same time, you've got Larry Flint's Hustler Club up here. And then you've got, come to our place, come by the boats and gamble a little bit. It'll be fun for you, and it's no big problem. And we've got all these different kind of temptations, some of which are direct temptations in that they're right in front of us. And so this talk really comes, or my question, I should say, for this talk, really comes about what about those activities that in and of themselves are not really good or really bad, although they may have some potential for both, but they might be put to good use. And what do we do about it? And of course, to be crystal clear, I'm not saying that the church allows us to sin just by jumping through some loopholes. This is a classic issue of moral theology, and it's a very, very simple and direct issue of moral theology, but rather than just dump out a bunch of vocabulary, what I want to do is give the clearest, most direct, practical application that I can give with as little vocabulary as we can get away with. And so to be specific, I'm thinking here about things that are somewhat perceptible to moral danger. And I'm not trying to get too caught up in whether or not these are good ideas, broadly speaking, or whether they are sociologically positive, nor do I want to fall off the edge into questions of, well, Father's talking about smoking, but smoking's bad. And what about vaping? Vaping's a whole separate thing. And what about smoking marijuana? And what about, we can fall off a cliff of trying to be too specific on some of these things. I'll mention all those things, but I don't want to try to make a moral, or I don't want to try to make a medical argument for any of these things necessarily, because there's a lot of back and forth. Is a glass of red wine every night good for you? I guess it certainly could be. I guess it depends on how big that glass is. My sister has a glass that is literally an entire bottle can fit in the glass. And, you can make an argument that would be good for you. You'd certainly feel fine about it, but that's a separate question. So let's lay out the principles, and we'll use alcohol because it's present in the Scripture and it's easy to understand. So we'll lay out the principles. We start by being clear and saying that alcohol is bad for you. Full stop. It's a toxic chemical. Ethyl alcohol is a toxin. And while a glass of red wine may or may not have health benefits, alcohol is a poison that affects our livers and our innards and our brains and prevents us from making good, rational decisions. As a habit, it can do long-lasting damage to the physical body. Great. So, that being known, taken in moderation and used with prudence, then prudence requires an understanding of my personal tolerance as well as legal tolerances, then alcohol can heighten or relax us, and it can significantly add to the celebration or the pleasure or the joy of any given occasion. But those three principles are the two principles so far that we have are moderation. That is, I take the right amount of it, and prudence. That is, I make a reasonable or rational judgment of it. Now, the moral principle has a fancy name. It's called double effect. And the moral principle basically says, listen, drinking is self-poisoning, which is bad. But if we limit the quantities, alcohol can become something celebratory and good. So we have one action with two potential effects: self-poisoning, but less self-poisoning, and joy and happiness and sweetness and fun and delicious red wine or tasty bourbon. And so we have kind of this double effect. That's the moral principle that takes the that we use. And the centerpiece of that principle is our third and final piece of vocabulary, and that is the question of our intention. If I am intending to get drunk, whatever I'm doing is a sin. It doesn't matter how little or how much I drink. If I'm simply intending to drink my problems away, my intention is bad. And there's no way to make something good from a bad intention. If my intention is to enjoy the company of others and to have a pleasant glass of wine with supper, then even if I inadvertently have a second one and I'm not necessarily being as moderate as I should be, the question of sin is very, very different, because the intention drives the entire centerpiece of this question of, is it good or is it bad? Now, moderation and prudence both add into that equation, and that's where the moral kind of principle and the moral judgment happens, with this combination of intention and moderation and prudence, understanding my own tolerances for good or bad. And so you can see why this is a moral gray area. It's not crystal clear. It's not easy to hammer it down. And if you've ever had a 16-year-old come home having had an alcoholic beverage at a party and trying to find a way to talk their way out of getting in trouble or grounded or something like that, then you've certainly heard a lot of this mumble jumble kind of sort of thing. But these three words really do define the whole question. We have the idea of, what was my intention? Then we have the idea of, what is a moderate amount of that for me? What is a reasonable amount that I can take that is not too much, but that accomplishes what my intention is? And then, am I using real prudence, that is honesty with myself, and saying, where is my tolerance, good or bad, for this particular action? With alcohol, that's relatively easy to judge, right? Because I can say, hey, I went over to someone's house, I had a glass of wine, I didn't have a buzz of any sort of thing like that. It was all very pleasant. It made the steak taste a little better, and everything was wonderful and good. So I had a good intention, I was moderate, and I was prudent. When we shift the gears to something that's a little more vague, it can be a more challenging question to ask ourselves. Take something like a movie. If we take something like a film that's coming out in the movie theaters, and perhaps we've been asked to go see this movie, maybe we're talking about Top Gun Maverick or something like that, and someone says, oh, this film's going to be excellent, let's go see this film. And you go, okay, well, now we have an entirely different moral question, because what are we going to see in the film? Are we going to hear a lot of vulgarity that's perhaps going to offend our sentiments or our situation? Are we going to see a lot of graphic violence that's going to take place? Because that's a very, very difficult thing for some folks. Maybe there's going to be something in that movie that is a personal touch point for me. Maybe I was in the military, and I have a certain issue within me where when I see the military misrepresented, I get angry or I get upset. Maybe there's going to be graphic sexuality in the film. What do we do about that? Is that something that I feel okay watching? Now, for those who have seen Top Gun Maverick, and it should be everybody, that's not a movie that includes any of those things to my knowledge. There's one scene that is pretty, tasteful in terms of sexuality, and there's a little bit of vocabulary, or a little bit of language, but it's a pretty great film. But if we shift gears to whatever random horror film is coming out next week in the Saw/cut-em-up slasher franchise, it's a whole different animal, because every one of those films is the same formula. Whole lot of bad language, whole lot of blood spilling out, whole lot of naked people strolling around. And so it becomes a great deal more complicated to say, I think I can morally go see the Saw 37, the slasher's revenge, because that is an entirely different sort of thing. In both those movies, though, Top Gun and Saw 37, the same three questions come into play. What is my intention? Am I going to spend some time with friends and enjoy one another's company and be entertained by a story that hopefully will make me feel good? Or am I going to watch something that is going to be graphic and that's going to indulge the worst parts of myself? What is my intention? Then the question would move on to, can I do that in moderation? There is, for example, a movie that I like a lot called Atomic Blonde. This is a movie set in the late 1980s, right at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it's got this incredibly cool fight scenes and all this 80s music, and it really touches all the right parts in me that make me excited. And in this movie, there are a handful of moments where the characters are in ill dress, but you say there's only a handful of those moments, and really it's not as bad as a lot of other films. The language is a big problem, and the violence is really bad. Now, violence doesn't bother me because I grew up playing awful video games, and so it doesn't really have any effect on me at all watching someone's head explode or whatever. But still, there's some real moral questions about my own personal tolerance for violence, or for looking at images that are perhaps sexual in nature, or for dealing with bad language. And those questions have to come into play. And in fact, those questions aren't even absolute. It may be that if I've had a really bad week and I want to watch a movie like this to indulge those parts of myself that want to watch brutal justice be done against the people who are doing terrible things, well, then we have an entirely separate question. But again, it's the same three issues of morality. It's my intention, it's my moderation, and it's my prudence. As a personal example, last night, I'm giving this talk the day after the Wyoming primaries that took place, the election took place in Wyoming. Now, I have friends in Wyoming. I'm not from there, but in politics, there is a woman named Liz Cheney who's been making a whole lot of political hay about herself. And so I watched on the internet, there was some kind of window that live updated the results, and she got the pants beat off of her in the election. Now, I won't lie and pretend I wasn't very excited about that, and I wasn't looking forward to that, because I had been frustrated by some other stuff that happened earlier this week, and so it was probably something I should consider going to confession for, because here I am, schadenfreudeing my way through, watching this woman get the snot beat out of her in an election, and for most people, you would say, how could anybody say that this was an immoderate thing to do? How can anyone say that it's bad to watch the results of an election in a state I don't even live in? And yet, here we have the same three questions. We have the question of my intention. Was I honestly trying to get some information, or was I hoping this woman was going to get the snot beat out of her? Well, that's not a very good moral place for me to be, because I think I was probably further to the latter side. Then the question becomes, was I doing it in moderation? It would be one thing if I checked that at 10 p.m. and saw the result. It's an entirely another thing if there's a window on my computer that is kind of popping up live results. And then the question of prudence arises, where I know that I can tend to fall off into politics and lose myself in it, and that's a dangerous thing. And so you say, gosh, Father Ryan, that was probably not a good idea to watch that video, or to watch rather this little live ticker of the reports, but that's very much a moral gray area. And we could expand this out. We've talked about alcohol, we've talked about some movies, but we could expand that out further to be issues of politics, or questions about gambling, or gaming, which is a big deal for a lot of young people nowadays. There are people in 28-day detox programs because of gaming, if you can imagine. Like, there are full-time facilities to help people deal with that. And of course, we could expand it out to any number of other issues. It's one thing to say we're going to go to the boats, which is what folks here say, go into the casino to gamble a little bit. Some folks can do that, and it's no big deal. They go and they spend $30 or $40 on slots. They eat the buffet, maybe have a glass of wine and feel like that's been a pleasant evening. That was worth it, and it was cheaper than Father Ryan going to see Maverick for the 13th time. Or it might be that someone goes to that casino and they're there and they intend something very good, but because they're immoderate, fall off the cliff, and their entire paycheck now has gone to that casino, and they've done real damage to themselves and to their family. And so we have this whole broad question of the gray areas. Now, the one thing I've not gotten into and I want to step into is the question related to tobacco, and really related to all drugs, and that is the question of health. Because while we know alcohol taken in excess on one occasion can do damage, we don't have a whole lot of good medical science that says, what if you have a glass of wine 3 times a week for 30 years? Is that going to cause damage to your liver? We don't really know. We don't think so, but medical science is not super clear. So what do we do about those gray areas that have a direct provable negative effect on the body. We know tobacco is bad, right? There's no way to get around arguing it. Now, we also kind of have the sense of knowing that if you smoke 3 packs of cigarettes a day, you're doing real serious damage to yourself. If you're around someone who's producing that much secondhand smoke, that's real bad. There's not a whole lot of science, I tried to look it up, on what happens if you're that person who has 1 cigarette a month, or if you're around somebody, once a month who smokes a little bit. And even the doctors on the charts are not 100% sure what to put, where they say, are you a smoker? And I might say to them, well, 5 or 6 times a year I get together with some friends and we have a cigar, and they're like, is he a smoker? Is he not? They're not sure what to put on the chart, because that is a genuine open question. What about those things that do some damage to the body, but maybe don't do a lot of damage, or maybe they do damage that's minor, or maybe they don't really know? It's a question. It's an open question. And really and truly, I have a priest friend who does smoke too much. No question, he smokes way too much. And he's a pipe smoker. And when I'm around him, I'm coughing, just to be inside the house. He's a big smoker. And I've told him that he smokes too much. And when I tell him that, he looks at me and goes, I'm not afraid of God. And there's a certain humor component of that. I'm like, well, I guess that's the good attitude to have if you're going to smoke as much as you do. But there is a genuine moral truth in that statement, although I don't think that gets him out of smoking too much, and that's a big problem. But there is a genuine issue, and we see it very easily in the modern world, where people make an idol of health and wellness. And we are not going to live forever, regardless of how we conduct our lives. If I smoke all day long, I might cut 20 years off my life. But if I never smoke at all, I'm not going to add 20 years to it. We are all going to die at some point. This is the nature of human life. And so there is a genuine moral gray area about what about those things which are potentially damaging to physical health, and what do we do to balance that question with broader issues? And before we get too judgy and say, well, this is crystal clear, Father, come on, are you trying to make some kind of moral tap dancing to justify your random cigar from time to time? But I'm not. Because if we were to ask ourselves, what about traveling and flying? Right? Flying is a relatively dangerous thing to do. It's certainly not as dangerous as it used to be, but does that mean that Bishop Fulton Sheen, who used to take tons of cross-Atlantic flights on prop planes, if you can imagine, that's a dangerous thing to do. That's putting your life at risk. And we stop and say, is that okay? Good Lord, nowadays going to New Orleans for a wedding reception and staying in the quarter for 2 or 3 hours can be about as dangerous as, going to Cartagena. We put our lives at risk on a somewhat regular basis. And we have a lot of different things in our lives that are potentially dangerous to us. And there is a certain moral gray area there as well. And tobacco functions as a really nice, visible way of thinking about it, but it really does expand out beyond that. And it is kind of funny, I won't get into too far into it, but it makes me laugh, that in the 1800s, when tobacco usage had really exploded, in Italy, the use of snuff had become a big thing. And I don't know if any of the viewers nowadays know what snuff is, but it's basically this kind of powdered tobacco that you would take, almost cocaine style, this kind of stuff, and it would make your mouth and your breath and your snot, it just was gross. It's still a gross thing to think about. It's not as nasty as chewing tobacco, but it's right there at the edge. And the Pope, which pope it is somewhat confusing, but the one who actually wrote the memo to the Vatican was Pope Pius IX, Pio Nono. And Pio Nono liked using snuff. And there had been this kind of vague moral rule where if the Pope was a smoker, then everybody could smoke. And if the Pope wasn't a smoker, then nobody could smoke. And there was kind of like, that was actually the way things were run for a bit. And it's ludicrous, but we actually had a series of letters and speeches and memos written by cardinals and popes arguing about the use of chewing tobacco, snuff, cigarettes, cigars, and pipes. And it reads like something Mark Twain would have made up because it's completely ludicrous. But the moral principles that we use to evaluate it and that they use to evaluate it are exactly the same moral principles that I've laid out already. What is my intention in using these things? Am I being prudent and reasonable in that usage or in that intention? And then am I being moderate in the way that I go about acting? And so we can argue, because these are Italian bishops, that's all we can do is argue. But we can argue with them about whether or not the intention was good. The intention is that doing this thing gave them a sense of pleasure, it calmed them down, and it gave them something to do with their hands and made them feel like, as Italians, they like to use their hands, that they could be more engaged in conversation, and it was a helpful socializing tool. I actually have two friends who studied theology in Rome, and they had to take up smoking because there were so many smoke breaks that they couldn't actually have conversations about theology with the teacher because all the best conversations happened at the smoke breaks. And so if they sat in the classroom while the teacher was outside smoking, they were missing out on parts of the lesson. And they had to take up smoking to get the whole of the lessons that they needed, and then had to come back to the United States and had to give up smoking, which turned out to be a lot harder than they expected. And so you have these kind of bizarre moments where there are arguments to be made, but the questions are the exact same. My intention, a prudent decision, and am I being moderate based upon an honest evaluation of my tolerance for the good or the bad? Now, the last thing I want to add here, just as a conclusion, is all of this depends upon honesty, right? All of it depends on being honest with myself and with others. I can lie about my intention all day long. If I want to go see some filthy movie and I tell myself and others, well, I wanted to see it because it's an art house film. Well, lying isn't going to help anybody. Jesus sees right through that. And if it's a sin, it's going to be a sin. And if I lie to myself to convince myself it's not a sin, it's still a sin. And so these questions of my intention, of a prudent decision and of a moderate decision, those depend upon honesty. And so these moral gray areas, and in fact, all the moral gray areas that we encounter are going to come down to the same three principles. If I'm honest with myself, I look and I say, this decision that lies ahead of me, what is my intention here? And then, based upon that intention, am I making the prudent decision and am I being moderate? And we could extend this to all sorts of things. What if mama's on a ventilator and we need to pull mama off a ventilator? I have to make a moral decision. It's a gray area. How do I go about doing that? Well, I'm going to ask myself, what is our intention? Is our intention that we're going to keep mama on the ventilator because we're afraid of losing her? Are we going to take mama off the ventilator because I want to feel better for myself, because we want to save money? I mean, what are our intentions? And then we say prudently, have I talked to the doctors? Is she going to get better? And then even in the realm of moderation, we say, is this something that we can morally do? Or is this something we feel like we are able to do? Is this something that within the realm of within the realm of possibility? And that would apply to anything. That would apply to questions of illicit drugs, where someone might try to make a moral argument for marijuana. I don't think there is a moral argument for marijuana, but that's the exact same questions. And it's the exact same questions across the board in moral gray areas. And so I think it's helpful for us, I should say, I hope it's helpful for us to realize that there are moral rights, there are moral wrongs, but in the middle there is a legitimate gray area, but it's not as if there is no right way to make that decision. It's just that decision is not something that is hard and fast, based in fact. It's based upon an honest evaluation of what's going on in my heart and mind. And then from there, I start with, why am I doing this? And once I've answered the question of why, then I can start to answer questions about making decisions based upon what I can handle and what is genuinely the best of the choices before me. And so moral gray areas can be fun to talk about. And every time I ran a school, every class that I went and visited always would pose a bunch of these wildly bizarre questions. What if an alien came to Earth and wanted to steal Apple's intellectual property for the iPhone? Would that be morally okay? Just bizarre questions. But again, it all boils down to the same handful of simple analysis. And so I hope this has been in some way helpful. I've been Father Ryan Humphries. This has been the CU Catecast, and we will hopefully see you again later on.